Welcome to our show today. We are honored to have a special guest that's going to talk to us a little bit about, organized crime all over the world. Actually, he's very, an expert in, all over the world. Actually, so we have Michael Vigil. Sorry, not Miguel. Um, uh, And I'll just give a little intro, Miguel.
Sure.
Not Miguel,
Thank you.
Michael. Miguel in Spanish.
Either one is fine, Alex. It doesn't matter.
Okay, brother. So Michael Vigil was born and raised in New Mexico. Actually, he attended New Mexico State University and earned a degree in criminology, graduating with honors. Mr. Vigil served with the DEA for 31 years and retired as a senior executive service level. He served as the special agent in charge of the Caribbean and San Diego divisions. He was also the chief international operations and was responsible for managing all DEA offices worldwide. Mr. Vigil developed global counter-drug and terrorism strategies. He was the recipient of the National Association Police Organization, the Top Cop Award, which is the most prestigious in law enforcement. He also developed international intelligence collections platforms. Mr. Vigil is the author of several books, including the highly acclaimed book Deal, that recounts his dangerous career as an undercover agent for the DEA. Welcome aboard.
Thank you so
Mr.
much
Vigil.
for having me, Alex.
It's an honor, to have you here with us, talking about some of the things that you've done and your knowledge. I know you're like an encyclopedia of knowledge. you know a lot.
I am.
I was extremely impressed with your knowledge of what you know and what you've done, and you come not just as someone that knows, but you have personal knowledge because you were there. You saw it, you know the principles, and you know everything. So anyways, so it's an honor to have you here for sure, and honored to be talking with you.
Well, it's an honor to be here, Alex. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, and I look at this as a forum to educate people because a lot of people really don't have an idea of how drug trafficking works, how it exists, how it proliferates. And most often than not, I believe that people see television programs and they see these police movies or programs where they see a SWAT truck, rolling up to a house. The police officers jump out and they go into the house and then they come out with a little bag of marijuana and they say, "Boss, we hit the jackpot." And they don't understand that a lot of these cartels that operate in Mexico, in Colombia, in other countries, have the capability of trafficking tons of drugs. These are billion-dollar organizations that are pretty much structured like corporations. And they're probably more powerful than corporations because you have some of them that actually operate in over 40 countries, such as the Sinaloa cartel that is currently the most powerful cartel that exists in Mexico.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that I noticed being an active police officer for the city of Albuquerque and seeing everything that was happening in Mexico, and the majority of the police officers have no clue what goes on and the impact everything that happens in Mexico has in the U.S. And if you don't look closely and see the writing on the wall, you miss it. You think, I busted someone, or I found a stash house that that they're trafficking with either people or drugs, whatever. But they don't realize that behind that is a big operation that goes all the way to the big cartels. They make all their money in dollars, billions of dollars a year. So it's very lucrative for them. And of course, they have people operating here in the U.S. Very low profile, but it exists.
Well, sadly, I think that the media here in the United States, and I'm talking about local media outlets as well as national media outlets, don't cover the drug trade like they should. For example, once in a while they'll cover an event such as the capture and the extradition of a drug lord like Chapo Uzman, but they key on other things that deal with the economy, with politics. But I think that, they need to do a better job in terms of educating the American public in terms of the threat of these international organized crime groups that traffic in drugs. Simply because, if they're not educated, they're not going to understand the dynamics, and that puts them way behind the power curve. So I think that education is key. And, I look at some of the local media outlets here, and, they cover things like the planting of a weeping willow tree, in southern Albuquerque,
Right.
but they don't cover anything that I would consider significant where, people understand the dilemma that we have here in the United States or even in New Mexico with the trafficking of drugs, the influence of some of the Mexican cartels that not only traffic heroin, cocaine, marijuana, but now, their big money makers are the synthetic drugs,
Exactly.
which is, methamphetamine and even fentanyl.
Yes. Yeah, and we see the media covering a lot of the, like the trafficking on the streets, and the people, the addiction problem. But very rare do you see them going after the source where all this, most of the drugs are coming from across the border.
That's correct.
But I was going to say, so tell us a little bit about your, your trajectory as a DEA agent. Kind of bring us from the beginning, how you got started, what made you go into the DEA, and maybe talk a little bit about some of your assignments, where you were assigned, and your roles in that agency.
Well, I was born and raised in Espanola. It was a very sleepy town at that time. We didn't have a lot of crime. And I always compare it to Mayberry. It was a very decent place to live in. I went through the Espanola school system, and upon graduating from high school, I decided to go to New Mexico State simply because it was one of the few universities in the country that offered a 4-year degree in criminology police science. So I went there, and when I graduated from New Mexico State, I decided that I was going to apply to a lot of agencies, which I did. But the one that really attracted me was the DEA. And the DEA had a charter to not only work domestically, but also work foreign. At that time, the charter for the FBI was domestic. The charter for the CIA was foreign. And the other thing that interested me was the undercover work that was offered through working with the DEA, working abroad and what have you. So I applied with the DEA, and DEA had just been formed because when Richard Nixon declared war on drugs in 1973, he created the DEA under his reorganization Plan 2. So I applied, and I had to take a federal service entrance exam, which was really tough, because it only dealt with math, which I hate math, and then it also dealt with English, and it was, what is the best sentence structure. I was fortunate enough to pass it, and then I was offered a job with the DEA. I came on board, went to school in Washington, D.C., and then when I graduated, they sent me back to Albuquerque, which was a good thing. And then from Albuquerque, I went to Nogales, Arizona, But prior to that, I worked undercover for about a year in Denver against one of the top 10 heroin drug distributors in the country. But I go to Nogales, and most of my work was working undercover in Mexico. And because of the high level of corruption in that country, I basically worked by myself. I would go across the border, meet with drug traffickers, and then I would not bring in the Mexican Federal Judicial Police until the delivery was already set. Later, I went into Mexico itself to Hermosillo, Sonora, and then from Hermosillo, I went to Medellin, and I became the agent in charge of the office in Medellin, and that was the heyday of Pablo Escobar. And we really didn't have a lot of information on Escobar. You know, we knew he was a very significant trafficker. So we started to collect a lot of information, and I used to sit maybe about 4 or 5 feet away from him at soccer matches.
Wow.
And the thing that struck me, Alex, was, you know, this is a guy that wore blue jeans, immaculate white tennis shoes, and then a very cheap velour shirt that you would get at Walmart.
Mm-hmm.
You know, nothing ostentatious. And then all his assassins, or the sicarios that hung around with him, you know, they look very much like an ordinary street gang that you would find here in New Mexico or any state in the Union. But this is a man that was ultra violent, and he literally brought Colombia down to its knees in terms of extradition. You know, he was executing politicians, police officers, soldiers, you know, planting car bombs. So it was a very, very violent time. And then later I went to, you know, Miami, to, you know, different places. I served in about 12 or 13 posts of duty, and then, you know, retired after a 31-year career. But I was able to get a lot of very valuable experience working, especially in the foreign arena, because I got a good feel for the top-tier drug trafficker. Because, you know, when you deal with these guys in the foreign arena, you know, we're talking about major drug lords. And then the people here in the States, you know, and I tell individuals that, you know, they're 4th, 5th tier drug traffickers. So that's why I enjoyed working abroad. I worked in Mexico for a total of 13 years, and then in Colombia 3.5 years, the Caribbean 2 years. So I have extensive experience abroad.
Can you tell us a little bit about your Afghanistan duty?
When I was chief of international operations, after the 9/11 attacks, as you well know, the United States decided to go into Afghanistan, and they basically removed the Taliban from power. And at that time, Afghanistan had become the #1 producer in the world of opium and heroin, supplanting Myanmar, or Burma, as it was once called. So when the Taliban left, the opium crops started to reemerge heavily. So there was the conflict that was still going on, and we weren't getting a lot of support from the military, because military did not want to, U.S. military and the coalition forces did not want to supply manpower for force protection for our operations. So I created what I called Operation Containment, and that was basically to seize the opium and heroin as it left Afghanistan. So I brought in 25 countries, to include the Russians, to include the Chinese. I even had the Iranians coming to the planning conference, but then George W. called them axis of evil, And they said, no, we're not going to attend the meeting.
Right.
So I structured the entire strategy, and we had the meeting, and it was kind of interesting because, a lot of the people that gave speeches, they gave them behind podiums. I never like to give speeches behind podiums if I can help it.
Right.
And, these are people that were used to going to war, and their leaders would stand in front of them, not behind a stand. They would stand directly in front of them. And that's what I did because I study history, and I studied the history of that area. So I stood in front of them, and one of the generals from India said, well, we need the support of the Pakistanis to basically secure our borders. And I figured, this is going to lead to some conflict here.
Right.
But the Pakistani general said, we will help you, we will work with you. And, they've always had issues, but they all came together simply because it was an operation that was for the greater good of all the countries. We're not talking about, economic conflict. We're not talking about political conflict. And, they knew that drugs, would cause, their children, their families great harm. So they came together. And prior to Operation Containment, within that region, they had seized maybe a few kilograms of heroin. And within the first year of Operation Containment, we seized 24 metric tons of heroin in that region.
Okay. Just recently, I was watching the news where they were talking about the Taliban rounding up all these people that were addicted to drugs. So I imagine now that the U.S. is out, and that environment is not really as controlled or as, yeah. Do you think the drug problem is gonna increase over there?
Alex, I think that the situation is so grave that Afghanistan is probably going to become a narco state.
Yeah.
Simply because the Taliban doesn't have a lot of resources right now.
Exactly.
They're suffering in terms of the economy.
Right.
The U.S. government has frozen $8 billion of their money, which they want, but they're not going to get. And because primarily of the conflicts that have been going on in Afghanistan, for example, the Russian invasion, which started in 1979, lasted 10 years to 1989. And then after the Russians withdrew, it went into a civil war. So what's happened is a lot of the men in that country have been killed, leaving the wives and the families to fend for themselves. And they don't have the money. In Afghanistan, most of the population, about 80% of the population, subsists on the equivalent of $2 a day. A lot of the families don't even have that money. So what is happening in Afghanistan, and it is really tragic, is that the mothers of these families that no longer have the father are injecting themselves and their children with heroin to stave off the pains of hunger. So the addiction rate there is quite high, but there's going to be a resurgence, if you will, of opium poppy cultivation and the production of opium and heroin. Most of the heroin that's produced in Afghanistan goes to the European market. What we see here in the United States is only maybe about 1% of that Afghan heroin coming here.
Because of the logistics.
Most of the heroin that we have here in the United States, Alex, comes from Mexico.
Yeah. So you think that the structure in Afghanistan right now is going to weaken it, and maybe these drug lords, even in Afghanistan and even from other countries, will take advantage and open and expand their drug, especially the heroin industry.
I think that the warlords that exist in Afghanistan are going to continue cultivating opium poppies, generating opium and heroin. And I think that the Taliban is going to allow them to do it because they don't want to go to war with them. They don't want a civil war. And then they're going to see it, secondly, as a means to generate revenue that they sorely need in that country.
Wow, yeah. I think that's, it's not good.
No.
For overall for Afghanistan. But let's come back to over here, this hemisphere.
Okay.
And you were talking a little bit about Undercover. We have read and seen a lot of shows on the Kiki Camarena deal, him working undercover, and eventually getting executed and killed. And, we call it a levantón. They abducted him. The actual federal police abducted him and turned him over, and he was subsequently killed. And I know there's a big risk. I've come across it every so often. In fact, when I was talking, we did an interview with Lalo. He was talking about how the DEA operation in Juarez got, they found some of the agents through, Lalo talking to people and finding out that, that they were embedded in Juarez. And I'm sure, there's a big risk, I'm sure, that, because you don't know who to trust. The police in all levels, basically there's corruption in all levels of law enforcement. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the risk, and how you managed to navigate through that over there in Mexico?
Well, I was pretty brazen in working undercover because, I knew that I had to do certain things to get the investigation underway or make it successful. Now, I will tell you that within the DEA, there's only a handful of people that actually do undercover work. Not all of DEA does it.
Okay.
And you need, pretty much, a very strong mental attitude, fearlessness. And I remember, working undercover and going into Mexico and what have you. But one of the things that I realized, Alex, working in Mexico or any foreign country, was that the key to working in those countries was basically identifying cadres of people that you could trust and that you could work with. And the other key was developing personal relationships, because a lot of DEA people, the FBI, and other agencies that operate in these countries, they'll go see the foreign counterparts maybe once a month or whatever. I would go see them every day. And I would go to lunch with them. I would go to dinner with them. I would go have drinks with them. And so they would do things for me that they would not do for anybody else. It was, you have to work much harder when you're working in the foreign arena than you do here in the United States. And a lot of people are just not willing to go above and beyond the call of duty, so to speak.
So one thing that happened a while back, I don't know if you remember, there was the massacre of Allende, in where part of the Zetas in that region over there a while back, it happened where the DEA was heavily involved in that operation when they were trying to get, they use those disposable phones to communicate, so they'll have them for a month and then they get rid of them and get another one. And they had, informants, like I'm sure you had informants that actually work with some of the cartels. And it was basically what happened, it was that they were able to get some of the phones of the high-ranking drug lords, and the DEA ended up sharing some of the information for the federal police in Mexico City, and there was a leak. And that's the problem that I've had, even myself. Working with some of the law enforcement over there, where they'll talk, but then, most of these are not. And how do you vet, these law enforcement over there? But you mentioned the trust issue is huge, and the circle has to be, I imagine, very small, so that you don't compromise your safety.
It's very small, and it's interesting that you mentioned the Allende Massacre. And what happened there is that in the DEA, in many countries, we have what we call special investigative units.
Mm-hmm.
These are units that are vetted. They go through a polygraph. They go through a drug urinalysis test. They're sent to Quantico for 5 weeks of training. They do backgrounds. But here's the problem with those vetted units is, like, for example, in Mexico, they will allow you to vet the group, but not the commanders that are in charge of that group. And apart from that, I think that DEA needs to do a better job in terms of more frequently doing polygraphs. So in this case, it was one of the people that worked within that vetted unit that gave the information or sold the information to the Zetas, which led to that massacre. And we've had instances where those things have happened. There's other agencies that also have vetted units, for example, with the military. And there's been instances where information has been compromised. So they have to do a little bit of restructuring. They have to pressure these governments to allow them to vet the people in charge of the vetted unit. And if they don't want to, then cut it off right within the unit.
Yes.
And the unit cannot provide the information to people in their chain of command that are not vetted. Because if not, the leaks will continue. But the mechanism should work to the point where you can give ultra-sensitive information to the foreign counterparts, and they take that and then use it to generate high-level investigations or operations.
So, I know Mexico is very big on not having, boots on the ground, U.S. agents, boots on the ground. I know that's been an issue for a while. One example is the capture of El Chapo. But I'm sure that Mexico really depends and relies a lot on the U.S. and DEA and the FBI, CIA, not just for technical aspects of it, but also, for experience and working with some of these cartels and having, we don't have the level of corruption as over there. I always think cartels are hard to eliminate because of the corruption, because Mexico, in a sense, allows it.
Absolutely correct.
Allows it. But how do they interact? How does the Mexican authorities interact with U.S. agencies in that aspect?
Well, I worked in Mexico for a total of 13 years, 6.5 years in Hermosillo, Sonora. And then later I came back to Mexico after having served another post of duty and went to Mexico City for 6.5 years. And I always had a very good working relationship with the Mexican Federales, or the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. Worked very well with them. I understood, that there were components that were corrupt. But I managed an operation that was called Operativo Halcón, or Falcon, Operation Falcon. We called it the Northern Border Response Force. And that was in the 90s when we had a lot of aircraft coming in from Colombia, coming into Mexico and bringing in loads. And I managed the operation on the U.S. side, and we had 4 Cessna Citation II aircraft equipped with forward-looking infrared, and then also equipped with F-16 radar. So we had a profile on these aircraft because they would be flying lights out at night, flying between 18 and 24,000 feet, no flight plan. And then what the Colombians would do is they would alter la matricula, or the registration number, so that, if somebody saw it, they won't be able to trace it back. So we started to really hit them hard. But one of the things that I had is a lot of times we were in hot pursuit of these aircraft with U.S. aircraft, that were tracking them. And I had the ability to call the Mexican government with one phone call and say, I need permission to bring in this U.S. aircraft into Mexico following this suspect aircraft. And they would say, do it. And this was, this could have led to very nasty situation in terms of violation of a sovereign airspace, but they would give me that permission. And sometimes the U.S. aircraft were running low on fuel and over Mexican territory, and I would say I need to get this aircraft refueled, and they say, okay, have them fly into Acapulco. We'll turn on the runway lights. It was usually in the dead of night. And, have them refuel. We'll have the trucks there. As soon as they refuel, have them get out of there before any reporters or anybody sees them. So I had that capability. On another occasion, we were working a case out of Sinaloa, and we were following all these individuals, to include a guy from Sweden. And they sent 2 fishing boats to the Galapagos Islands, which was a staging area. And we had Coast Guard cutters. We even had a U.S. submarine loitering there. And when they started to head northward back towards Mexico, I get a call from an admiral out of Alameda, California, which was the Joint Interagency Task Force that was located there. And he said, we want to take the ships down. There were 2 of them, and I still remember the names, the Mardoqueo and the Daniel Torres. And I said, no, you can't take him down, because if you do, we can't prosecute the individuals here in Mexico. If the Mexicans don't seize it, they're not going to be able to prosecute. So he said, well, it's on your head if something goes wrong. I said, I'll take that risk. So sure enough, one of the boats come to the mouth of the bay there in Mazatlan, and I had the Mex-Feds go in a small boat that was slower than hell, probably 1 nautical mile an hour. So they go way out there, and they board the Mardoqueo. And apart from that, I called them up and I said, I need the Coast Guard to come in to your territorial waters, the U.S. Coast Guard, in pursuit of this. And they gave me authorization to bring the boat into territorial waters. Feds go out there, they board it, they bring it back to shore. I told the comandante, I said, you have to notify your Navy, because the Daniel Torres is continuing northward along your coast. So the next morning, the comandante comes over to see me, and he says, can't find there's no drugs there. Can't find them. And I said, well, concentrate your efforts on this guy here that was one of the individuals involved. So he goes over there and punches him in the stomach. Well, that's not what I had in mind, but the trick worked. Right. And he points to the hold of the ship, and what they had done, Alex, is they had cut out a hole in the hold where the bales, consisting of about 20 kilograms of coke, would fit perfectly into that hold, and then they had it covered with very heavy steel sheets. So unless you know exactly where it was, you were not going to get it. Then the Mexican Navy was able to intercept the Daniel Torres. The total seizure from the two boats came out to a little over 15 metric tons of cocaine.
Wow. Let's talk a little bit about El Chapo,
Okay.
Mike. So one of the things that, I was following all of that was happening with El Chapo, for years. Of course, he remained hidden. And a lot of it had to do with, the authorities didn't really want to find him in Mexico, I believe. But finally, something happened, and it started with Sean Penn and that actress that went to go visit him. Remember that?
Castillo, yeah.
Yeah. And after that, they kind of flushed him out of the mountains for somehow. They were, I'm starting to think that maybe they were able to trace his location. And he was on the run. He almost caught him in a couple of places in Aloha, and they ended up catching him in Mazatlan. Anyways, there's rumors and there's a lot of people talking that the U.S. played a major role with the capture of El Chapo. What's your take on that?
Without question, Alex, because when it comes down to counter-drug efforts in Mexico, I would say that the DEA is responsible for a lot of those operations. I'll tell you why. Because the Mexican government does not give the Mexican Federal Judicial Police, or now they've been merged into the Guardia Nacional or the National Guard.
Right.
But they didn't give him money to pay for informants. They didn't have a lot of capabilities for intelligence collection. DEA has a lot of money to pay informants. So we would pay the informants, we would develop the information, and then, we would work it together with the Mexican Federal Judicial Police. Mm-hmm. But when you were working undercover or whatever, or, you had to do the undercover work, or you had to plan out the operation because they didn't have a lot of experience. They didn't have a lot of training. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good people within those ranks.
Yes.
A lot of people that want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And, a lot of my friends from the federal police lost their...
And also for the military, right? You have a lot of the Mexican Marines now. They're, AMLO has decided to go with the National Guard more. But back then, those Mexican Marines were capturing a lot of the big
Exactly. So... And a lot of them gave their lives, and
mm-hmm.
My hat off to them, because they very courageous, very valiant young men. But anyway, I remember, working undercover, and one time I was working undercover in Caborca, and I had gone there, and an informant had introduced me to these two individuals. And so I went there. I said I wanted to buy, I don't know how many tons of marijuana. And I said, okay, I'll be back in 2 weeks. The Mex Feds gave me loaned me a seized truck with a big camper shell. And I go there. I didn't have the money or the flash roll to show them. So what I did is I took a bunch of $1 bills and put a $100 bill on each side, and then taped them to my legs, so that they won't be able to thumb through the bills. And the two traffickers that worked for Rafael Caro Quintero, because that was a stronghold for Rafael Caro Quintero.
He controlled that region.
In Caborca, Sonora. Yeah. So I go back and I meet them at this gas station, a combination restaurant. And one of them tells me, si eres federal, te vamos a desplumar, which meant if you're a Fed, we're going to kill you. Mm-hmm. And the guy keeps telling me, oh, we're going to kill you, this and that. if you happen to be a Fed. So one of the men goes with the informant to go pick up the load, and I stay with the other individual there, and he's threatening me, and it starts to, an hour goes by, 2 hours go by, it starts to get dark, and there's one of the Mexican federales, that I see towards the window, and he's lifting up his hands like, what's going on, what's going on? And I'm thinking, what do you expect me to do? This guy's threatening to kill me, and I'm going to tell you, wait a minute. So, the trafficker decides he's going to go to the restroom. There's no restroom indoors, so it's an outdoor toilet. So I figured I better go because, they're going to do something crazy. Mm-hmm. And I walk out with them, and sure enough, one of the feds comes and sticks his gun right into the chest of the trafficker. And the trafficker now grabs the barrel, and he's got leverage now. Mm-hmm. So he turns the gun, and the gun goes off and hits the Fed in the head. And I remember this very clearly, and I see a spray of red blood just go up in the air. And then he turns to me, and I was maybe 3 feet away, and fires 2 shots. This all happened like in a nanosecond. Mm-hmm. And I could literally feel the bullets go by my left ear. And anyway, he's brought down. The Cruz Roja, or the Red Cross, comes in. They pick him up. He's on the verge of dying. And the truck with the bad guy and the informant roll in there, and they see all the feds with machine guns and the crowd there. And he floors it, hits a tractor-trailer rig with a camper shell and turns it on its side, drives off, and then makes a curve and jumps out. Thank God he didn't kill the informant. But those are the things that would happen. So when you were working undercover, you didn't only have to worry about yourself, but you also had to worry about, the untrained counterpart police that, they were good. But the thing is that, they just didn't have the training, and they didn't understand that when you're doing undercover drug deals, they never go on time. It's not like you just waltz in there and the guy's waiting for you with the load. It takes time, sometimes many hours, and they just didn't have a lot of the patience.
Right. And are you armed? Were you armed when you were working on these operations?
Yes.
So you were allowed by the government, the Mexican government, to be armed?
It was a nod and a wink by the Mexican government, Alex, because the only ones that could really give you that authorization was the foreign ministry, mm-hmm. and they were not about to do it.
Right.
So, but they would allow us to carry the weapons, but it's like don't
tell anybody.
But anyway, getting back to Chapo Guzman, Chapo Guzman is a very interesting character because he was born in La Tuna, in the municipality of Badiraguato in the state of Sinaloa, very poor. Mm-hmm.
That's in the mountains, right?
That's up in the mountains. It's actually like a little hamlet, mm-hmm. and he had 2 sisters, 4 brothers. His mother was the matriarch of the house. His father, Emilio, used to cultivate marijuana and a little bit of opium gum, but he was a very brutal man. He was a drunk. The money that he made, from selling opium and marijuana went to women and then liquor. Mm-hmm. And he would come in and he would beat Chapo Uzman. He would beat his brothers and sisters, and his mother would usually stand up mm-hmm. and try to protect him. And when she couldn't, Chapo Uzman would run over to his mother's house, his grandmother's house. So Chapo Guzman always believed in matriarchs. And when you study the Sinaloa cartel, you see that he's got a lot of women in high places laundering money, helping him traffic drugs, because he believes in matriarchs. So The only cartel that existed in the 1980s was the Guadalajara Cartel. The main leader was Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. He was a state police officer in Sinaloa, and he eventually became and developed the Guadalajara Cartel. And then you also had Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo and then Rafael Caro Quintero. And what happened in 1985 was the kidnapping of Kiki Camarena. He was taken right outside the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara and then taken to a residence in Lope de Vega that belonged to Rafael Caro Quintero. He was tortured, and Rafael Caro Quintero comes on one occasion, and he's all coked up, and he hits Kiki Camarena with a blunt instrument, and, you know, he's dying when Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo comes to the house and looks at Camarena, and he slaps Rafael Caro Quintero on the face, and he said, "This is your baby. Now you live with it." So we went after these guys with a vengeance. And I was in Colombia by that time because I had transferred to Colombia in October of 1983. And I started to track the source of supply to the Guadalajara Cartel, a guy by the name of Juan Ramon Mata Ballesteros.
From Colombia?
And Mata Ballesteros was actually Honduran, but he was in Colombia because he was married to Nancy Vasquez, who was Colombian with ties to the Cali Cartel. But Mata Ballesteros, major player, because he was the intermediary between the Cali Cartel and the Medellin Cartel headed by Pablo Escobar. So he was supplying the Guadalajara Cartel with tons and tons of cocaine. I was able to capture him with the Colombian National Police. I had them put a wire intercept on a house belonging to a Colombian drug trafficker by the name of Jaime Garcia. And I rented a house for the Colombian National Police, but we couldn't see the front door because the garage went out to the street and the door was, towards the back. And on one occasion, I saw some very strange activity there. And I told the colonel of the Colombian National Police, I said, "I think this guy's there. We're going to hit it." So we surround the house, and I go to the front door with the colonel, bang on the door. Maid opens a side window, not the door, a side window, and she says, "What do you want?" And I told her in Spanish, Colombian National Police were looking for weapons. I didn't want to say that we were looking for Mata Ballesteros. And she gets all nervous. She doesn't want to open the door. Few seconds later, guess who comes through the window? Mata Ballesteros. And I tell him the same thing. And he said, "Oh, wait a minute. And he moves away from the window, and I told the colonel, I said, "We need to get in there." He said, "Oh, no, wait. I said, "I'm not waiting." So I kicked down the door, and Mata Ballesteros is running in a courtyard with a 9mm in his hand. And I give chase. He jumps over a wall and can't navigate the second wall and falls in between them. Later, I found out he was able to do that because he had just had back surgery. So I peek over the wall, and he's there lying in his back, pointing the weapon straight up. And I just stuck my weapon over the wall, and I was getting ready to shoot him. And he says, no, don't shoot. I can get out of jail, but I can't get out of a tomb. And then offered me $3 million if I were to release him. And he said, I'll have the money here in 20 minutes. Obviously, I didn't take it. And then we transferred him from Cartagena to Bogota, put him at La Picota Penitentiary. And sure enough, several months later, he bribed the entire prison guard population and he just walked out the prison one night to a waiting Mercedes-Benz. They took him to El Dorado Airport there in Bogota, and then he flew to Honduras because he knew that Honduras did not have an extradition treaty with the United States. But we went to the Honduran government and said, do you want Mata Ballesteros or do you want U.S. foreign aid? And they said, take him. So we grabbed him again. And, I remember him getting off the plane in New York, totally shell-shocked. And he's telling the reporters, me secuestraron, they kidnapped me. And he's got a little apple in his hand, but he's totally shell-shocked. But, very, very interesting stories.
Wow. Amazing.
Anyway,
yeah.
Getting back to Chapo Uzman. Chapo Guzman, when the Guadalajara Cartel disintegrated with the capture of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo in 1989, it kind of fractured. They had a meeting.
They also arrested Caro Quintero eventually in Costa Rica, correct?
They arrested Caro Quintero before that in Costa Rica, and then they arrested Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo in Puerto Vallarta.
So they're both still incarcerated?
No, because Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo is in really bad health, so the Mexican government stated, okay, well, you can serve out the rest of your time under house arrest, but you can't leave your house. And then a judge released Rafael Caro Quintero, and the reasoning that he used is that he was charged with murder at the federal level with the killing of Kiki Camarena, and he said, this is the bailiwick of the state government. The state government should have charged him with murder. But it went to the Supreme Court of Mexico, and they said, no, you shouldn't have released him because Kiki Camarena was a federal agent of the United States working with the federal government. But the damage was already done. So they had released them. Obviously, he went back to the drug trade because that's all he knows.
So how come they didn't extradite him?
Because the Mexican government has a very spotty record, with extradition, because the extradition treaty with Mexico was signed way back in 1862 and then ratified again in 1976. But a lot of times political issues influence whether or not Mexico is going to extradite somebody.
Do you think it had a lot to do with the death penalty? Because he's facing the death penalty for killing a federal agent, correct?
But not here because...
Oh, because it happened over there?
Well, no, this is the way it works, is that whenever we request the extradition of a Mexican citizen, for example, the Mexican government, which is, in Mexico, the population is 84% Catholic, okay? So they don't believe in the death penalty. So before they'll extradite anybody, you have to give them written assurances that they will not be exposed to the death penalty.
Which the U.S. will never do.
Well, they do. They have done it.
Done it?
They have done it, like with Chapo Guzman. When they extradited Chapo Uzman, we had to do that. When they extradited Ociel Cárdenas.
Okay. But then the U.S. knew that El Chapo did not qualify for the death penalty because he got charged mostly for trafficking drugs.
And also murder. But it's off the board. We have to take it off the board.
Right.
Otherwise, they won't extradite him.
I see.
And the key with extradition, Alex, is that all of the kingpins, all of these drug capos fear extradition because once they get here, they're no longer going to have access to their criminal infrastructure. they're not going to be able to run it. They're not going to be able to have the resources that they have over there.
And the corruption.
And the corruption. So they fear it. But getting back to the meeting that they had in Mexico City, and at that point in time,
the Guadalajara people,
the Guadalajara people out in 1989, and they divided and they formed the Tijuana Cartel, which was headed by the Ariano Felix brothers, and then the Juarez Cartel that went to Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and then you had the Sinaloa Cartel that went to Chapo Guzman, and then also Güero Palma.
Mayo Zambada.
And Mayo Zambada. And, you know, we captured Chapo Uzman, you know, along with the Guatemalan authorities the first time in 1993. They put him in Puente Grande. And, you know, later he escaped from there in 2001 when he thought he was going to get extradited. You know, he jumped into a laundry cart. You know, they helped him escape there, you know, collusion from the correctional officers.
Yeah.
And then he was captured again in 2014 and sent to the most secure penitentiary in Mexico.
Supposedly the most secure.
Yeah, Altiplano.
Right.
And, you know, they built a 1 mile long tunnel. And we estimate that they took out over 3,000 metric tons of dirt. You know, it was about 5'7" tall, about maybe 2.5 feet wide. It had power, you know, lighting. It had ventilation with PVC pipe.
Tracks.
It had tracks with a motorcycle to take the dirt out. But here's the interesting thing: is I was talking to Genaro Garcia Luna, who was the former Secretary of Public Security under Felipe Calderon, who's been arrested here in the United States, and he's awaiting trial. And he was telling me, he says, when you know, the Altiplano was constructed, we had the American Correctional Association come in to help us with protocols and security, give us you know, guidelines. And he said one of the protocols was that the prisoners in Altiplano had to be transferred from cell to cell to cell to prevent escapes. Well, Chapo Uzman was never removed from that cell. He was always in the same cell.
That's interesting, because I always thought about that you
Yeah.
know, and they were able to build this tunnel straight into his bathroom, which requires someone that really knows what they're doing, you know,
Well,
with GPS coordinates and all that.
Well, the thing is that they had a watch that they gave him so that they could get the exact coordinates of his prison cell. And then Chapo Uzman, when he was digging tunnels on the southwest border,
He built a lot of tunnels.
a lot of tunnels. And he was sending some of his people to some of the best mining schools, like in Germany, so that they could study the best techniques. Now, to get from that little house a mile away from Altiplano, I'm positive that they use this really state-of-the-art equipment. It's called Total Station. And I'm sure, Alex, you've seen, you know, when surveyors are using those little telescopes and then somebody's over there holding a bob so that they can get measurements. Well, this one is a system that shoots out a laser beam
through the dirt.
Underground. Underground, because GPS does not work underground.
Right.
So what it does is it shoots out a laser and it hits a crystal prism, and it bounces the signal back to the total station, and it allows for the curvature of the Earth, and you can build a tunnel a mile long with a variance of only maybe 8 inches.
Wow. So that kind of directs him
Directs
to the
him.
precise location.
Exactly. And then I'm sure that they had some of the floor plans, you know, like, you know, they had to know, you know, where the water systems were, where the electrical systems were. They had to know the rebar, where the rebar was underneath the ground, how spread out the rebar was. And when they were punching out the hole in Chapo Guzman's shower, it was creating a lot of noise. It was just bang, bang, bang. And the prisoners in the other cells were yelling and screaming, because it was very annoying to them. Right. And the guards in the control room could hear it also, because it came out later that, they had both video and audio throughout the penitentiary. They tried to hide that, but they couldn't. And, so again, the correctional officers colluded with them. Yeah. But he goes back, and people were saying, oh, he went to Central America, he's in South America. I said, no, he's not going to go over there and risk getting captured, and then they're going to send him right to the United States. He's going back to the mountains of Sinaloa, Durango, Chihuahua, the Golden Triangle there. And sure enough, that's where he went. Yeah. And
he knows the area real well because he grew up over there. What's interesting is Pancho Villa hid in those same mountains.
Exactly.
And the U.S. couldn't even find him.
No, and they had airplanes, trying to locate him. Yeah. But anyway, he escapes, and then he starts to, Kate del Castillo, the famous actress in Mexico.
He was obsessed with her, correct?
He was, and what she did is she sent out messages. I forget if it was Twitter or whatever.
Text messages too,
and saying that Chapo, wouldn't it be good if you could traffic in love instead of drugs and all that? So Chapo Uzman sees those messages, and he makes arrangements to have her come to see him. She wants to do a movie of Chapo Uzman. Mm-hmm. So she brings in Sean Penn. Sean Penn's really not interested in doing a movie. All he wants to do is do an article for Rolling Stone.
And that's what he did.
And Chapo Uzman, they say he wanted to do a movie. He wanted to have a sexual relationship with Kate del Castillo is what he wanted. Mm-hmm. So by this time, the U.S. is tracking him, because when Chapo Uzman had escaped and he was up in the mountains, they brought in a kid from Colombia that had a night tea shop, a guy by the name of Christian Rodriguez. Mm-hmm. And they flew him from Colombia to Mexico and then into the mountains where Chapo Uzman was hiding. And Chapo Uzman wanted the cell phones. They used BlackBerry phones to be encrypted so he could communicate with the people he needed to communicate with. So Rodriguez does this. And then later he finds out about Flexi spyware, where you can actually remotely turn on somebody's cell phone. For example, because Chapo Uzman wanted to monitor the conversations of his paramours and his wife and some of the other people within the Sinaloa cartel. So he would call them, talk to them, and they would hang up, and then he would, through a switch, activate the mics on their cell phone so he could listen into what they were saying about him. Mm. Later, Rodriguez is lured into the United States, and in an undercover capacity, the agents talk to him about encryption and all this, and then they tell him, we're going to arrest you unless you cooperate. So he gave them the keys and the codes to be able to
trace it,
to be able to monitor Chapo Uzman's messages, phone calls, all of that stuff. And that was very damaging evidence.
So they were tracing his conversations,
phones, yes.
and also finding out locations.
Exactly. But Chapo Uzman was one of those guys that, he didn't want to live up in the mountains like Mayo Zambada.
Right.
He wanted to come down. He wanted to enjoy life. He'd like to party. He'd like to dance. And the final capture was after the meeting with Sean Penn and Kate del Castillo, and he goes down to Los Mochis, and he's being tracked by this time.
And then even those stash houses had tunnels, huh?
Well, he always had tunnels. He always had an escape route.
Right.
And so the Marines hit the house. There's a shootout. The Marines are throwing grenades into the rooms, and Chapo Guzman and one of his lieutenants, El Cholo, as they call him, go into the draining system, the sewer system.
So they had a tunnel into the drain system.
Correct. There was a closet, and it had they could go into the sewer system, which they did during the shootout. And then the sewer system started to fill up. So all that, human feces and everything, and, they were up to their necks in it, and it was climbing. So they had to quickly exit the sewer system, and they get out in a main street in Los Mochis through a manhole cover, and they commandeer
They carjacked
a car.
A lady in a car.
And as it turns out, the car was the biggest lemon in Los Mochis and broke down.
Right.
So they commandeered another one, and they had also problems with that second one. Anyway, they were captured, and, he was sent back to Altiplano for a short time, and then sent to Juarez, and from Juarez they extradited him to the United States.
So they sent him to Juarez because he was going to be extradited.
Yes.
Another thing that has come up, and that I keep hearing a lot about, is that El Chapo, the corruption thing has been going on for a while, including the Felipe Calderon. You mentioned Genaro Garcia Luna, but I heard from a lot of sources that the Mexican government wasn't real happy that El Chapo was bringing attention, and that and because of that, they were forced to act and try to apprehend him. Whereas before, they were not, as long as you keep a low profile, and we pretend that we're trying to find you, but now, if Kate del Castillo and Sean Penn can go there, it makes us look bad. So now, we're gonna.
I think what it was, Alex, is that there's a lot of people that will say that they didn't want to go after El Chapo because they were protecting them, and that they were going after like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Right. And other cartels.
Los carteles del norte, noroeste.
But I think...
Is that my phone? Sorry. I thought I turned it off. Sorry about that.
But what it was is that in any country, law enforcement or security forces are going to go after the most violent organizations or cartels. And that's what Mexico is doing, because there's no more ultraviolet cartel in Mexico than the New Generation cartel. Oh, yeah. So they were going after them
because they bring attention more because of the violence.
Yeah, because of the killings, the violence, and and the same thing with the Zetas. When they separated from the Gulf Cartel.
Right.
So they were going after the most violent ones. But it's not that they were ignoring Chapo Guzman. Yes, the Sinaloa Cartel has a lot of politicians in their pockets. But so does all the other cartels.
Exactly.
What happened with Chapo Guzman is that when he escaped, from the two most maximum secure penitentiaries that gave Mexico a black eye within the international community because their prison system could not hold major drug lords, and then the corruption within the correctional systems. But there were things that came out in his trial that I really think were fabricated by the individuals that testified against him. For example, Jesus Zambada, Mayo Zambada's brother, and they call him El Pollo, he testified that he had personally delivered to Genaro Garcia Luna $6 million on 2 occasions in briefcases. It's not possible, because I've done flash rolls working undercover, like in Panama, of $1 million I had to put it on a big Samsonite suitcase. I couldn't lift it. I had to put it on rollers.
They were all hundreds and twenties.
And they were all hundreds. They were all hundreds.
All hundreds.
And so that didn't ring true. And then they made allegations against Peña Nieto that they had given him a $100 million bribe to protect Chapu Uzman, which, number one, the amount was ridiculously crazy. And then secondly, Peña Nieto wouldn't have been able to do that because, he had really no control over the state police or the municipal police. That was under the control of the different governors in Mexico. So a lot of those things just didn't ring true. There was a reporter in Mexico that recently was interviewing Aníbal Hernandez, and then he asked her, well, Mike Vigil said that Genaro Garcia Luna was innocent, and that's not what I said. What I said was that I never saw any acts of corruption from Genaro Garcia Luna because he always supported DEA operations. We didn't see any evidence of compromise. That's what I said. But to make a long story short, I think that the strategy that was created by Felipe Calderón when he came in 2006.
And he campaigned to take on the cartels. And
he did. And he went after him with a vengeance.
He did.
But what happened is that he didn't foresee that by pursuing the kingpin strategy and attacking the kingpins, and he killed and captured many of them. But what he didn't foresee was that the cartels would fracture.
And create a vacuum.
And create a vacuum. And then it was like the proverbial Greek hydra, where you chop off one head and 2 take its place. Yeah. And usually the components of the cartels that would come into power would be the sicarios, the enforcement arm.
The cells, the plaza bosses.
And the people that all they knew was violence.
Correct.
And that's why we see so much violence still taking place in Mexico. And then when López Obrador became president, he campaigned on the promise, and he said, well, I'm going to put the military back into their garrisons where they belong.
Right.
And then the first thing he does when he becomes president is he gives the military more power. He creates the National Guard.
Right.
And he meshes in the military police of the Army, the military police of the Navy, and then also the federal police. But there's issues there that create a lot of conflict because you'll recall that federal police agents in Mexico, just before they were eligible to retire and get a pension, they would fire them so they wouldn't have to pay them a pension. And they're still, in essence, doing that, whereas the military, they do get a pension. So there's a lot of friction there. But we had serious issues with the ex-Secretary of Defense, Salvador Cienfuegos. He was arrested at the L.A. airport, charged with drug trafficking, protecting H2. And
So he was a Secretary of State under Peña Nieto, correct?
Defense under
Secretary of
Peña
Defense.
Nieto.
So he was like a high-ranking cabinet member of the president.
He was in charge of all the military forces. Very powerful figure.
So why do you think they released him? I know the DEA had played a big role in arresting him.
Correct. What happened is he was arrested. López Obrador, in his statements, really
wasn't happy.
Well, he wasn't really concerned at first. And then what happened is the cabal of military generals started to pressure him to get Cienfuegos back. I suspect that they wanted him back because Cienfuegos was 72 years of age at that time, and they figure, well, he's not going to want to go to jail even for 10 years because that, in essence, could be a life sentence for him. Mm-hmm. So there's a strong possibility that he's going to cooperate. So then you had Marcelo Ebrard, the foreign minister, that went to Bill Barr, the attorney general at that time in the United States, and said, do you want Mexico cooperation or do you want Cienfuegos? You can't have it both ways.
In terms of extraditions, right? If you want us to
no,
turn
just
over
any type of effort,
cooperation
and what have you. So they sent him back, with the assurance of the Mexican government that they were going to investigate him. And I knew they weren't.
Right.
So he goes back to Mexico. Within 2 months, they say, "Oh, we didn't find anything. We didn't find anything." When he went back, he wasn't even under house arrest. He was just out there. And I remember being interviewed quite a bit by the Mexican media, and then you had the Mexican Attorney General that was saying that he was going to refer DEA because DEA had fabricated the evidence against Cienfuegos, and they were going to refer it to an international court. And I knew they weren't, but I gave an interview, and they were asking me about this, and I said, look, we don't fabricate evidence. We're not going to lose our career to fabricate evidence against an individual like Cienfuegos. And I know that the fiscal, the attorney general, stated that, we did this and we did that. And then I said, look, the proof is in the pudding. In the United States, at the federal level, we have a conviction rate of at least 95%. And in Mexico, the conviction rate is less than 5%. Right. And this is not me saying it, but, I had conversations with deputy attorney generals, and they were the ones that were telling me about, the horrifically low conviction rate.
I think that a lot of it had to do with, that DEA works under working with confidential informants. A lot of the investigations are confidential. That most of that is, is going to be sealed anyways when it goes to trial, and you can't really talk about the evidence as much as the talking is done in court when you go to court and present your case.
Exactly, because they said, well, the information that the U.S. sent to us, there's nothing there. But you will recall, Alex, we do everything on reports of investigation. We call them DEA 6s. Surveillances, undercover negotiations, everything goes into those DEA 6s. And none of those were sent to the Mexican government because they said, we're going to conduct our investigation.
And it
what have you."
compromises other things, right?
Well, absolutely. It compromises agents, compromises informants.
Other investigations.
And other investigations, you're right. And I remember, if you recall, under Salinas de Gortari, when he was president, remember his brother Raul? You know, we were coordinating with Switzerland in terms of bank accounts that he had there. He had over $100 million in one bank account. And the Swiss government froze it. One night I'm at home and I get a call from the Mexican Attorney General's office and said, "You got to give us everything that you have because, you know, the Swiss are saying that they're going to unfreeze the account unless we give them information." So I ran to the embassy, and I didn't use DEA letterhead or anything. I just put it on plain bond paper, and then I scribbled my name like a doctor would, you know, just like a chicken scratch. And I took it over to them because I knew they were going to leak it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, they leaked it. You know, they couldn't make out my signature. But you know, it hit the media. You know, the media had it. And you know, and they do those things, and those are in direct violation of the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty that we have with Mexico. You know, you can't do that, but they still do it anyway.
Yeah. Not only that, they you know, it's hard to keep anything. I mean, I mean, when you're dealing with Mexico, the integrity. Also, you know, you just don't know where that information is going to go. But anyways, let's go back to El Chapo a little bit. With now that we post arrest, and so right now, you know, the Sinaloa is fragmented in three factions. You know, you have the Mayo Zambada, who was equal to El Chapo. He was an associate. You know, he's an old school drug lord that has been around for a while. And he's been able to stay really low profile for a long time. Very few pictures of him, you know, so he's able to maintain anonymity, really. And then you have Caro Quintero, who is back, you know, and trying to, you know, seize control of the Sinaloa cartel. And then you have los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo, all fighting for control. And most of that is taking place in Sonora, who Sinaloa has control for years, you know, for years. What is your take on that? What do you think? Where do you think this is gonna end up?
Well, here's the thing: is that the cartel still remains strong. It really hasn't fragmented per se, because when you take a look at Rafael Caro Quintero, you know, he was in prison for 22 years. So when he got out, nobody really wanted to have anything to do with him, but he started, you know, his own little group of people. But they're not, you know, it would be like Muhammad Ali fighting an elementary school boxer.
So he's got to set up alliances, because there's rumors that he's setting up an alliances with Mayo.
No, because Mayo and the Sinaloa cartel don't want him. They don't need him. And actually, you know, they may eliminate him if he becomes a thorn to them. There has been conflict between los Chapitos and Mayo, but make no mistake about it, Mayo, you know, remains in total control of the Sinaloa cartel. The Chapitos would like to assume control because they know that if Mayo Zambada dies and they have not taken control of Sinaloa, it's going to fragment. Then they're going to have to be fighting with other individuals. Whereas if they have control, they have control. You know, it won't fragment. But the problem is that Mayo Zambada is not going to give them control at this point in time, because Mayo Zambada knows that the Chapitos have really never earned their stripes.
And they don't have the connections either. Like Mayo has developed connections through the years, you know, having contacts with government, politicians. The Maitos are up and coming. That are not experienced with that.
Yeah, and the Chapitos don't command a lot of respect within the Sinaloa cartel because what they were good at is spending Chapo's money.
Right.
You know, they were good at, posting pictures on the internet of their cars and their gold-plated machine guns and their bling and what have you. But Mayo Zambada is the oldest remaining capo that exists in Mexico, and I always compare him to Carlo Gambino of the Italian organized crime, one of the figures in the five mafia families in New York who never set foot in a jail cell ever, and that's Mayo Zambada. But Mayo Zambada, as far as I'm concerned, is much more astute than Chapo Guzman. He's much more cunning. And as long as he stays up in those mountains in Sinaloa, Durango, in the area of Chihuahua, he's going to die a natural death. But Caro Quintero, he's trying to, gain a little bit of a foothold, but, he would stand absolutely no chance against the Sinaloa cartel. I mean, he can fight little skirmishes and stuff like that.
In Caborca, he's you see a little bit of him, putting narco mantas here and there and stuff like that.
But he's very small. He's not the big figure that he was in the 80s. When the Guadalajara Cartel existed. But he's got to make a living. He's never done anything except traffic. And when he was with the Guadalajara Cartel, he handled the cultivation and the distribution of marijuana.
Right. Yeah. So do you think so? So what would happen if eventually? And there's rumors that his health is not real.
Well, Mayo Zambada has been around a long time. We know that he's got diabetes, a very bad case of diabetes. He's living up in the mountains, very austere environment, and, doesn't have access to health care for the most part unless they bring a doctor in. But I think Mayo doesn't have that much time, my personal opinion. But I think what's going to happen is that you will see a fragmentation of that cartel, maybe a component going to the Chapitos and others. And then, without question, there's only two supersized cartels, Sinaloa and then also the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. You have the Cartel del Noroeste. You still have remnants, small remnants, if you will, of the Zetas, the Gulf Cartel, and others.
Right.
But those are pretty much horses on one leg.
So what is your take on the Juarez Cartel in Juarez and the state of Chihuahua? I know that at one point, they were in a big battle with Sinaloa, fighting over that Plaza de Juarez. But you see still a little bit of, La Línea fighting with the Gente Nueva up in northern Chihuahua. In fact, they just killed, last month, they killed the chief of Villa Humada. And what is your take on that?
Well, the thing is that when Amado Carrillo Fuentes died, and people say, he was changing his facial appearance and all this and all that. It was vanity surgery. It was vanity surgery, Alex. He went in for a facelift and a liposuction. That's what it was. And the doctors told his bodyguards, don't give him any more medication. He's heavily sedated. Well, he wakes up and he's in massive pain and he says, give me painkillers. Well, his people are not going to say, no, we're not going to do that. So they give him more painkillers, and he overdoses and dies. And then his brother, Vicente, takes over the Juarez Cartel. They called him a viceroy. But he was not as smart or astute or the trafficker that Amado Carrillo Fuentes was. So there's, after his capture, it kind of fractured. And La Nina, which was the enforcement arm,
the arm wing.
The enforcement or the Sicario branch of the
Juarez Cartel.
Of the Juarez Cartel. They've taken over, so they're fighting against everybody. They're even fighting, the Barrio Azteca gang on the other side of the border, and that's created a lot of conflict. But I think the one that is really expanding their tentacles, at least in Mexico, is the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, because they're taking over states.
Yeah.
And
but do they control any border region? Because I know they're very active in Jalisco, Michoacán, that region over there.
Well, they work a lot of the Tijuana, San Diego area, because the Tijuana cartel is pretty much pretty crippled.
Yeah.
But they do engage in a little bit of conflict with other cartels that want to move in there, but for the most part, I would say that they are the primary controllers of that corridor.
I agree.
Of that corridor. Yeah. And the other thing, Alex, is that they're going in. They're starting to diversify their criminal portfolio, as Sinaloa. We talked about the synthetic drugs, methamphetamine, fentanyl, but they're also tapping into Pemex petroleum pipelines. Right. And Mexico has 6 refineries. And what they do is they tap in. Not everybody uses drugs, but everybody uses gasoline.
Right.
And the theft of petroleum from these pipelines is generating some of these cartels $1 billion a year. Mm-hmm. The other thing that they're getting into is the avocado industry in Mexico, because the avocado industry in Mexico is a $3 billion a year enterprise. And a lot of the avocados come from Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes, El Mencho, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel from the state of Michoacán.
Yes.
And right now, he's in a battle there fighting Los Viagras, the self-defense forces. And, people are, they're leaving ghost towns in Mexico, people having to leave their homes and move out of there.
And Mencho's not afraid to take on the federal police and military either, huh? He's, you see some battles where he's killed a lot of the police and military.
Well, El Mencho is very violent. And, he's ambushed, if you recall, police convoys, killing...
he killed like 14 of them.
14 of them, and, blood all over the highway, and the sicarios are going from body to body to see if they're still alive so they can execute them. On one occasion, the security forces of Mexico tried to capture him, and one of his men shot down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade, killing the 8 passengers on board that helicopter.
Which is amazing, because he's the only drug lord in Mexico who has shot down a helicopter.
That absolutely right. And he's just a very violent person, but what I see with some of the cartels in Mexico, you mentioned the Cartel del Noroeste and Jalisco New Generation Cartel, they're becoming like virtual armies. They're paramilitaries.
They even have tanks.
Yeah, and they have individuals that cut out sheets of steel and put them on trucks and literally build tanks.
Yeah.
And then they have helmets, they have uniforms, they have military-grade weapons. So Mexico, under López Obrador, they have to really start taking a stand, because López Obrador started this policy of abrazos y no balazos, hugs and not gunshots. And that has only empowered the cartels even more because that passive role, has, basically allowed them to act with greater impunity. They don't recognize the rule of law. And the sad thing about it is that it's the citizens of Mexico that are paying the price, regarding the López Obrador's policies.
Yeah. It's unfortunate because, like you said, Jalisco Generación is the up and coming, probably take matter of time before they take over as the most powerful cartel above Sinaloa. But what do you think about the in the Gulf Coast? You have, I think, the Gulf Cartel, Cartel del Golfo. I don't know. They're trying to make a comeback a little bit. You can see a little bit of them, but Cartel del Noroeste, they're. I guess they come out of the Zetas. There's I think a son of one of the drug lords of old school Zeta.
Yeah, the Cartel del Noroeste is managed or headed by
El Huevo,
a nephew of Miguel Ángel Trevino, who was the head of the Zetas at one time, currently in prison along with his brother Omar. But, they're in a battle there. But I look at the Cartel del Noroeste as being much more powerful right now than the Gulf Cartel. Now, Gulf Cartel are pretty much done. When they captured Jorge Costilla,
and Tony Tormenta,
and Tony Tormenta and these characters, and they extradited Jorge Costilla. So he's pretty much gone. So I look at, again, there's only two major cartels in Mexico, and you have probably, you need a scorecard to count all the other ones.
Right.
But the tragic thing, Alex, is that some of these smaller cartels have the capability, given the right circumstances, to also become major cartels. And if Mexico is not careful, you're going to have a major problem where you may not have the ability to go against these cartels,
right,
and to eradicate them, and then you got major problems.
Yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up. The other last topic that I was going to cover with you, Mike, is the spillover, the influence that sometimes we don't see, but it happens. The saying, drugs go north, money and guns go south. And the reason that these cartels are in business is because they sell their product in the U.S. It crosses. I know that we've had a lot of debates over border security, and it still doesn't seem to stop any of it. It's still flowing. I don't see a lot of the cocaine flowing as they used to be before. I don't know if it's due to the logistics, because you got to bring it all the way from South America. But it's still something that happens. How do you see, we don't see really the cartel activity dying anytime soon.
No, here's the issue, is that most of the drugs that emanate, for example, from Mexico, or the drugs coming from South America through Mexico, they go through the legitimate ports of entry. And the reason for that being is, that, customs and what have you, can't keep up with searching every vehicle that comes across. Then you also have corruption on this side as well. Then you also have tunnels, because if you took a giant knife and cut across the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border, it looked like a block of Swiss cheese because it's riddled with tunnels. The other thing also is that Trump, said, okay, I'm going to build a wall, it's going to stop drugs. That's nonsense, because you can circumvent that wall with medieval technology, with pneumatic tubes shooting drug loads over, catapults, but again,
a ladder.
so absolutely. So, people, the wall, we need to build the wall. The wall is worthless, And the thing is that when you take a look at the Great Wall of China, the Maginot Wall in France, where the Nazi army or the German army just went around it, the walls, fixed barriers don't work. And then there's also a thing that I call a psychology that goes with walls that people don't understand, is when you build a wall, eventually, for example, the people on one side will, like here in the United States, will start to fear the people on the other side. It's psychological. Mm-hmm. And do we really want to do that? And I believe in the old saying, build bridges, not walls, and I've had this debate, where Trump wanted to spend billions of dollars on a useless project, and that money could have gone into education, into infrastructure, it could have gone into healthcare, but people still believe that the wall is going to help. And I could go into this wall situation for an hour, but here's the thing, is that for many decades, Alex, we put too much emphasis on the supply side of the equation. If we are really going to do anything with this drug addiction that we have here in the United States, we need to do a better job in terms of reducing the demand. We're not going to be able to arrest our way out of this situation. We need to educate our children at a very early age, and this will encompass the families, the schools, the church, to teach the children. And then we also need, and I agree with this, treatment facilities to treat the addicts. But we need to do a better job there also, because it's not a matter of addicts going to the treatment facilities and then being detoxified, because then they release them, there's no follow-up, they go to the same neighborhoods, within a week they're hooked on drugs again. And this situation is getting out of hand. And then we also need to apply the law equally here in the United States, because we have a two-track system here, one for the rich and famous, and then the other one for everybody else. When you take a look at Purdue Pharma, the executives that poisoned or started the opioid epidemic here in the United States through Oxycontin, these individuals made billions of dollars, and they would show up at civil court, not criminal court, civil court, in their stretch limos wearing Giorgio Armani suits, and they would go in there and pay a small fine in comparison to the billions that they made. Chapo Guzman, who probably killed or poisoned less people than these pharmaceutical companies, he comes to criminal court in an orange jumpsuit, shackled. He goes to prison for life. The other individuals are out there reaping the benefits of their rewards, and they have killed a lot of people, but they put money into the pockets of politicians, and they get away with it. This is nonsense.
Right. That's true. Well, Mr. Vigil, thank you. You're like an encyclopedia.
Well, thanks, Alex. And the other thing that you'll notice is that I'm very outspoken, because I'm not a very timid soul when it comes to telling the truth and
your opinion, how you feel about
exactly
things. And that's important.
Exactly.
That there's always, you got people on the left, on the right, they have their own view, but we in law enforcement, we see it, and if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense.
Well, the thing is that we've lived it, Alex.
Yes.
So we have lived in that subculture, if you will, and this is what we know.
Right. Well, I thank you for joining us today. You have a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, and your insight I respect it. you're on, you know, you're on point with a lot of stuff that you have to say.
Well, it's a pleasure, Alex. I totally enjoyed the interview, and thank you for your service with the Albuquerque Police Department. And, you know, the state owes you a debt of gratitude.
Well, thank you, Michael. Okay, and that's it. We'll wrap it up for today. Thank you for joining us, and appreciate you guys watching.